project itself was commissioned about a year ago now by the National Network. Very kindly gave me a funding grant to take this forwards. And there's two parts to the project. I'm going to spend most of the time today talking about the first part, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about the second part as well. So the first part was a tracking study, effectively a piece of statistical analysis. And what I made use of was a new opportunity whereby one is able to connect the data that the Department for Education holds about young people in schools with the information held by the Higher Education Statistics Agency about young people at university. So that was the first part of the study. So I'm pretty sure that's the first time that type of exercise has been done. And it's the first time we've had that certainty about what's happened to young people who've come through care and gone on, or not gone on, as the case may be. Then the second element of the study was an online survey. It was something we did quite opportunistically whilst I was waiting for the data. And we gathered stories from 212 care-experienced current HE students of all ages, but mainly, again, in their late teens or early 20s. And so the fieldwork was undertaken, as I say, latter part of last year and the early part of this year. So first of all, to start off with, so in terms of that tracking, what I did was I got data on 650,000 young people. So a whole cohort across England of young people who hit the age of 16 in 2008. Now, of those, just over 6,000, just under 6,500, were deemed to be care leavers at that point in time. So they were in care at the age of 16. And of those, 675 of those then went on to higher education by the age of 23. So our numbers are getting smaller and smaller and smaller as we go down. And that was the group that I was really interested in. That's the group that forms the heart of the study, really. And what I found was that most of those had completed, but about around half of them hadn't completed. And also, of those that hadn't completed, quite a lot was still studying. And this is a theme that I'll come back to through my presentation. So of the 165 that had started, 140 I discovered had left and not returned. So the others either completed or were still in the process of being on their course. You'll notice all the numbers here are rounded to the nearest 5, and that's one of the requirements that I have for dealing with the data, is that I can't give you exact figures, but they're all rounded to the nearest 5. 25 of those 765 were actually doing master's degrees at the end of the period that I was tracking them. So there's even a sense of progression beyond an undergraduate degree as well. So the first finding really is that it's very momentous with the gongs going off all the time. The figure that's often been quoted and used in this area is that 6% of care leavers go on to higher education. And one of the things that I very quickly discovered was that figure was too low. The figure is more like 12%, 11.8 to be precise. Now, there's a reason for that discrepancy between the figures which the Department for Education released and the figures that I was able to get access to. Part of that is because some young people will have severed or lost contact with their LEA, local authority, sorry. And also, I was tracking a longer period of time. The figures released by the Department for Education stop at the age of 20 or 21, whereas I was able to track through to the age of 23. And that, again, is a key part of the message that I'm going to go on to talk about. So that's the reason for this discrepancy. I was capturing more young people, but also I was looking over a longer time period as well. So we start with the good news, if you like, that actually around double the number that we thought were going on to HE actually are, which I think is really good. But we still have this problem that the number is far too low. So 11.8% for care leavers. For those who have been eligible for free school meals when they're at school, 26%. For the general cohort of young people, 43%. So you still get a sense of that very strong difference in the percentages progressing between the 12% for care leavers to 43% for the cohort as a whole. However, I won't go into this table in too much detail. But if you then look at the qualifications achieved at 16, you'll see that those gaps narrow quite quickly. So for those young people who had got 8 or more GCSEs, actually the likelihood of them going on to HE was nearly the same for care leavers as it was for other young people. Even for those achieving 5 GCSEs, the differences are much closer. So one of the key elements of the report is the importance of GCSE attainment, that when we take that into account, much of that difference disappears, and I think that's a really interesting and useful finding. Again, one I'll come back to again a bit later on. So there's a few more sort of facts and figures here, which sort of brings into sharp focus, hopefully, the complexity and the layers of disadvantage that care leavers experience in terms of their likelihood of going on to HE. They're 3 times more likely to have a special educational need identified, and they're 9 times likely to have a statement of special educational need, the highest level of need. Of course, this data relates to 2007, so it predates the changes under the 2014 Act. 27% of care leavers actually had no GCSE passes at 16. That's 10 times the average. And the most common reason for them not having any GCSEs is simply they weren't even entered into any GCSEs because of the nature of their lives at that point in time. So 1 in 4 care leavers at 16 simply were not being entered into GCSE qualifications. So we've got these multiple layers of disadvantage, and those young people who are still in care at 16 have a particularly complex and disrupted set of life circumstances, and that then is reflected in their outcomes at that age. So the rest of my analysis then goes on to attempt to compare like with like. So I've used statistical methods I won't go into now unless anybody's really bored, to compare a care leaver with other young people who are outwardly similar, where the only difference is that one is in care and one is not in care. So I'm trying to compare like with like based on their qualifications at 16, special educational needs, the nature of the neighbourhood in which they grew up, gender, and a number of other variables and factors as well. So that takes us onto this little chart here, and this is where I feel like some of the headlines come in. So I looked at 3 points in time. I looked at the likelihood of entering, the likelihood of withdrawing and not returning, and then the likelihood of success, where we define success as receiving a first class or upper second class degree. So in the first box on the left-hand side there, what I found was that care leavers, like for like, all else being equal, 11% less likely to enter than a similarly qualified young person with a similar background, where the only difference, as I say, is that one is in care and one is not. So that perhaps is not unexpected. I was slightly surprised that number was as low as it was. I expected there to be a bigger gap. So actually that's quite good news again. They are less likely, but the difference is not huge. But where the difference is huge is in terms of surviving the course. So they're 38% more likely to drop out and not return to higher education. Again, all else being equal, so this is taking into account their entry qualifications and so on. So that's a bit of bad news. And then we come back to the good news again. And the good news again is that if they survive through to the end of the course, they complete their degree, they're every bit as likely to get a first class or upper second class degree at the end of it. So we've got a slightly mixed picture there. Slightly lower likelihood of entering, all else being equal, much greater likelihood of withdrawing, but actually a very good chance of doing very well. And one of the things that came out of the analysis was a kind of reversal. So the young people who had come through care were likely to be able to, in many cases, to transcend their GCSE results. They may have had poor GCSE results, but come out with a very good degree qualification. So there's a sense in which they were making up ground during the course of higher education. I think that was very interesting to me as well. This is an attempt to sort of demonstrate this in colour as far as I can. So there's 200 young people here. So on the left are 100 care leavers with 5 GCSEs, and on the right are 100 other young people with 5 GCSEs. So again, we're trying to compare like with like. And what we can see here, the black figures are those who achieved 5 good GCSEs but didn't go on to HE. And we can see that actually there isn't a great deal of difference between the two. Where the difference comes is in terms of the ones that are coloured in purple and in blue. And these are those that have withdrawn and those that are still studying at the end of the period in which I was tracking them. So what we're, again, coming back to this idea is they're less likely to be able to get through, and they take longer to get through the system as well. So this sort of brings me on to this next slide, the idea of these punctuated pathways. So on average, care leavers are taking a year longer to go to university. They're more likely to start at the age of 19 than at 18. So, and some obviously taking much longer still. They're much more likely to be entering with qualifications that are not A-levels. In particular, access to HE courses, vocational work-based options, foundation degrees, and in fact actually with no qualifications in many instances because they've come through on the basis of their professional experience. In fact, I teach on a foundation degree course at my university where that particular type of student is quite common. We see a lot of students in that situation where they've accumulated experience in the workplace which can then be validated through their degree course. So it's quite difficult to actually be able to track care leavers through the data because of these course changes, periods of dormancy, and just the fact that they are undertaking a non-linear path. They're not taking that traditional finish school, go to university, take 3 years, finish university. It's much more complicated than that. Although what was interesting is I looked at the reasons why those who withdrew, and those reasons are very similar to every other type of student as well. You couldn't point and say there was a particular reason why they had withdrawn. They fitted very nicely into the overall average. Okay, so moving on then. So that's the first part of the report, and I'll move on to the second part now briefly as well. So I also collected data not just about tracking students over time, but also the most recent data that we have as well from the Higher Education Statistics Agency. And from that data I was able to produce, there's just over 2,500 care leavers in HE at the moment. That's the best information that we have. It's probably an underestimate because of non-declaration, but it's the best guess that we've got at this moment in time. However, there's 3,500 young people who are otherwise care experienced or declared themselves to be care experienced, i.e. they left care before 16 or they returned much later in life as a mature student. So we've got around 6,000 young people currently in HE who have a care experience, with the minority of those being care leavers. And this was the group that I looked to try and survey with our online survey. And as I say, we got to just over 200, which is just about 3.5% of those people. So one of the things I would say here is that to treat this part of the report with a degree of care, because I only got to talk to 1 in 30 of these young people. If we did the study again, I'm hoping to move on to other work in the future around this area. I would want to get to a greater proportion than that. However, there were a number of things that came out over and again. So I used this thematic analysis approach to try and pull out the stories that I was hearing frequently. And some of those are very rich. Some of the people who replied to the survey took a very long time to give me a very detailed background and often very moving background to their own lives, how they'd come into higher education and what their experiences had been. And I'm just going to share some of those over the next few slides. So these are all quotes taken from the survey itself. And the first theme that I pulled out was around transition, around that movement from being in care, maybe in school, maybe in college, maybe in work, but moving from care into higher education. There was some excellent practice, very, very strong practice, where there was a clear liaison between the local authority, social workers, foster parents and others, with university support staff, NECL members basically. But that was a kind of minority experience. More common was a more fractured, more chaotic transition process. So you can see in the second quote there, very disorganised. It wasn't very informative. What do I get? It was very stressful, very disorganised. And this came out quite commonly within the accounts that I gathered. While stressing that there were also some very good examples of local authorities supporting their young people. But on the flip side, there were also some very, very disturbing stories about young people being put off higher education by their local authority, but having funding delayed because nobody was competent to fill out the student finance forms, to situations where the young person, when it came to the day to move in, they were just bundled into a taxi with black bags and told to get on with it, as it were. So there were some really quite difficult stories there as well. Less commonly, there were also stories about universities not being as responsive as they might be, and that tended to be where there wasn't a member of staff within the university who had specific training and expertise around young people who'd had care experience, where they were being pushed from pillar to post and nobody understood what it meant for them to be a care leaver. That was less common. As I say, the majority of the criticism was about the support provided by local authorities. So that's the first of the themes I want to draw out. The second is around, I've called here, struggle and resilience. And these stories of struggle we came out very, very strongly. Very, very strongly, particularly around academic integration. Very often the young people talked about having missed periods of school or struggled at periods at school because of the disruption in their lives. And they were having difficulty catching up because they were missing perhaps key parts of the foundation knowledge that was important for their degree programme. So even though they'd managed to meet the threshold to get into higher education, they were then struggling to keep up with their peers. There were a lot of stories around mental health and a struggle around dealing with the legacy of the childhood trauma, that had either that which had seen them being taken into care in the first place or that had accumulated through their care experiences. So the other element of that, the flip side of that, were the stories about resilience and determination. And they came through very strongly as well for me. And the last quote there really exemplifies that. This idea that this is my chance. This is my chance to turn my life around. This is the chance to succeed and to be a fully contributing member of society. Another person talks about, I don't know what I would do if I wasn't doing this. I think I would be homeless. And these were some of the most moving stories where there was a sense of determination, but sometimes also despair linked in with that. And it's interesting how the two can be two sides of the same coin. And the final thing that I wanted to draw out is around the sense of community, and again coming back to this idea of the legacy of experience of care. So the importance of being able to fit into the university community. We know this from a large amount of research studies across all young people, across all students indeed, about the importance of feeling part of the university community. And a large proportion of the young people who replied to the survey told stories about how they'd struggled with that process, and indeed at the time they replied to me were still struggling with that process, that they didn't feel they felt fitted in. The second quote there, for example, where the student didn't want to tell people that he'd been in care, so he told them that he was an international student, because he felt that was a more acceptable thing to tell people in order to be able to build friendships. And then the final point is one which I think was some of the most moving stories were where the young people talked about their experiences in childhood still having a strong and lingering effect on their mental health as an adult. And they talked about post-traumatic stress, and I think increasingly that is understood to be part of that experience. And the difficulties in accessing the types of mental health support in universities that they needed in order to flourish. It wasn't a case of providing a low-level counselling or low-level advice on healthy living or whatever. These were people who actually needed long-term therapeutic interventions where universities were not well equipped to provide that level or type of support. Okay. So coming to the end, what I identified in the report are 6 factors that I think support success based on the evidence that I've accumulated in this study. Strong Key Stage 4 attainment, good GCSE results. There was nothing better in terms of a young person's progression into and survival through higher education than having strong GCSEs. Yet we know that these are young people who at the age of 16 have disrupted lives, where achieving highly is going to be problematic for them. But those that did achieve highly were those that went on and did very, very well in higher education. The second point is around this managed transition, that this is that where I saw examples of that clear pathway of moving support gradually in some instances between local authority and university. That's again where I saw very strong outcomes for students. Membership of the higher education community, how the young person is interacting not just with other students, but also with staff as well. And there were stories about staff needing to be trained in what is a care leaver, what is care, why has somebody been in care in their childhood, and stories about academic staff not understanding, appreciating that. Fourth is around resilience and determination. I've already talked about that. The fifth is around strong disability and mental health support. So if you remember towards the beginning of the presentation, I talked about the proportions of special educational needs amongst care leavers at 16, and how also those are translating into mental health problems or related to mental health problems when they're arriving at university as well. And then finally, and this I think is a really important one, is around the importance of these alternative pathways. That idea of going from 18 from school to university just doesn't hold true for many of the care leavers who are going on to higher education. They're coming in later, they're coming in through work, they're taking longer, they're perhaps having periods of suspension or periods of part-time study. And I think there's a key element there around that being supported by universities, by government and by local authorities as well. So that's the end of my overview of the report.